Hi guys, Mr. Shaw and I were talking and we decided that we want to help you understand this flowchart, decision chart a little bit more, as we've kind of noticed that some of you've got it and some of you are still trying to figure it out. So to kind of go over it a little bit more clearly, we have the confidence interval and our hypothesis test. So this covers Chapter 8 and the hypothesis test is Chapter 9 and Chapter 10. Okay, Chapter 10 is for 2 samples, but the flow still works the same. It can be applied to Chapter 10, but we've used it mostly in Chapter 9 so far. All right, so as we take a look at this, we need to look at your questions and you have to decide, okay, is it a confidence interval or a hypothesis test? So if they're asking you to find a confidence interval or an interval, then you need to decide, okay, is it going to be from a proportion or the mean? If it's from a proportion, then you're going to come down here to the required check. That's a Q. Okay, the required checks are down here at the bottom. And since this is a proportion, the required check for the proportion is that it meets the 3 conditionals of the binomial. In other words, that it has a set number of trials, that each trial is independent, and that you either have success or failure. That it's a random sample. And then for this part, because this is for the interval, okay, this is for the interval piece of it, we use this, that the number of success and the number of failures are greater than or equal to 5. This test part comes over here with the hypothesis test. Okay. And then part on the bottom is telling you what you need to use on your calculator. So when you go to your list of tests on the stats, you're going to come over here and it'll say 1 proportion Z interval. That's the one that you want to use if this is your situation. You use the Z interval when it's a mean and you know the population standard deviation. So let's talk about that for just a second, the population standard deviation. All right, so to add some clarification, we have different symbols for population and sample. If we're talking about the mean for the population, we use mu, and the mean for the sample is x bar. The standard deviation for the population is sigma, and the standard deviation for the sample is Sx. All right, so we're talking about sigma here, so that's from the population. All right, so in your question, you need to see, does the standard deviation come from the population, or does the standard deviation come from the sample? Okay. Now, if it comes from the population, that means that we're going to go with this route, and it makes it a Z interval. And you have to do your required check, and the required check for the mean is that it has to be a random sample, and it can be either one of these 2 things, either normally distributed, and it'll say it follows a normal distribution, or that the sample is greater than or equal to 30. All right, now if we come here and we see that we were asked the question about an interval, we know that it's a mean, but we do not know the population standard deviation. Then we're going to do the T interval. You still do your required check, but now this is going to be a T interval instead. These spots on the bottom, that's where it's telling you what you're going to use on your calculator. And then these required checks, you're going to either do it for the proportion or the required check for the mean. Okay. And that's going to be the same thing on the hypothesis. It's either going to be a proportion or a mean, and you either know the standard deviation for the population, or you don't know the standard deviation for the population. You still have the same required checks, except for on the proportion required check, instead of using the number of successes and the number of failures, you're going to use the probability, so the sample size times the probability of success, and the sample size times the probability of failure. Okay. And then this would be a 1 proportion Z test. This one is a Z test. This one is a T test. Now, I've written up here Chapter 10 because this is the same kind of decision chart you're going to be using. It's just that instead of for a single sample, we're going to be doing it for 2 samples. So instead of it being a 1 proportion Z test, if we're doing it in Chapter 10 and we have 2 samples, it'll be a 2 proportion Z test. We hope that adds a little bit more clarity to this chart.